Puede que cambie el mundo, quizás también nuestras prioridades. Pero si algo ha quedado claro, es que lo primero es nuestra salud. Necesitamos más que nunca sentirnos bien, cuidadas, respetadas, informadas, empoderadas y unidas. Las matronas forman parte de la profesión más antigua del mundo, cuidando mujeres y favoreciendo su fisiología durante toda su vida, sin perder su esencia, sin dejar de avanzar. Seguiremos evolucionando, siempre dando lo mejor. Crea tu perfil. Encuentra cualquier servicio que necesites. Filtra según tus necesidades. Compara las valoraciones y comentarios de otras usuarias. Comparte a través del foro internacional. Intercambia, busca o vende cualquier producto. Estamos preparadas para el siguiente paso.
Hi, my name is Caine. Thank you so much for taking time to listen to this. I am a midwife. I have a doctorate in health sciences, and I have been asked to present the findings of the research that I have done on midwifery-led care. I've been asked by Helena Elimi. I have known Helena for a long time. We have been travelling to Spain and South America since 2016, and I have had the pleasure of getting to know Spanish and South American midwives since that time, and it's with real delight that I'm going to tell you about the research. This research I have been doing for years. I think it's very important. I think the findings are very important in moving us forward as a profession, in getting a really good understanding of what the impact of our work is. So I'm going to start and take you through it now. The title of my research is All You Need is a Dark Space and a Good Midwife, an exploration of midwives' enactment of the defining attributes of midwifery-led care in midwifery-led intrapartum settings. All you need is a dark space and a good midwife came from one of the quotes given by a very senior midwife from one of the case study sites. I thought that really captured the essence of what midwives thought about their care, that what was needed was somewhere where you could replicate really good environment, i.e. a dark space, and having a good midwife. And I think that when I go through this presentation, you will understand what the concept of good midwife or good midwifery meant to these midwives. I should say that I was very privileged to receive a PhD studentship from the University of East Anglia in the UK. That's the university where I work as a midwifery lecturer. And I should also say that I work clinically at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital, which is also in Norwich, as is the university. I had the supervision of Professor Kenda Crozier and Dr. Jenny Moore. And a little tip I would say to all of those aspiring PhD students: choose your supervisors well if you can, develop really good relationships with you. They are going to take you through and be with you on your journey. So it's really important that you have a good relationship, and it's a trusting one with them. And mine were very trusting ones. And part of my success is their success. So the way I've organised this presentation is to talk to you about the different aspects of it. So I'm going to go through the research, I'm going to talk about the introduction, the background of it, I'm going to go through the methodology and the methods that I used, I'm going to talk something about the analysis that I used, how I analysed and interpreted my data, and then I'm going to talk about the findings. So how did I get here? How did I get here? What was the start of my personal journey of my PhD? And it is a journey. I was lucky enough to be one of the core midwives in our newly established midwifery-led unit. So that was the midwifery-led unit that was built and established at the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital in Norwich, and I was one of those midwives who answered the call to be part of the staff there. And during my time there, as the months went on, I noticed that women came in, straightforward, low-risk women, because that's what midwifery-led care is directed at. That's who the demographic that it's for. So these straightforward, low-risk women came in, had very straightforward, lovely births, a lot of them water births, a lot of physiological third stages, a lot of drug-free labours and births. And particularly nulliparous women, they did really, really well. So they had relatively short, straightforward, uncomplicated first stage of labours. They pushed their babies out beautifully, a lot of them in water, and there were no complications. And yes, they were low-risk women, and that is what you would expect. However, the data does tell us that it depends on where these low-risk women are giving birth. And the outcomes can be different when low-risk women give birth in an obstetric-led unit. I wasn't looking at that in my research. That's probably another topic to take on later. But what I saw, I was very curious about. So that's really that's the impetus for me to look at what was happening, what the care meant, so that I could interpret it and analyse it. So a bit of a background to midwifery-led care. So in the UK, from the 21st century to the last decades of the 20th century, midwifery-led care has been one of the defining attributes of maternity services. There has been policy put behind that. So ever since 1992, when a very seminal review of maternity services, which was the Winterton Report, found that even though outcomes were good, the maternity services resulted, the care that was delivered resulted in healthy mums, physically healthy babies, it was safe. There was something lacking. And what was lacking was satisfaction that midwives felt with the process and satisfaction that women had with it. So really the conclusion of that was it's not just about a safe a birth and a safe mother and a safe baby. Something else needed to be part of the maternity services. There needs to be more involvement of midwives. Midwives needed to have more professional input into it. They needed to have more professional satisfaction with the process. So the government response to that came in the next year, 1993. That was led by Lady Cumberledge. And what that found was that what that surmised was what was needed was choice. What was needed was choice and continuity and control. That piece of work was encapsulated in a document called Changing Childbirth. And so let's look at those things. So choice, women needed choices around maternity care. At those times in particular, women were healthy, they were young, they had no complications, they weren't sick, they were coming into a service, they needed to be able to make choices about it. They needed control in what happened to them. They needed control in the care plans that were made about them. And then the concept of continuity, which has endured up until the current time. They needed to have some continuity. It was not satisfactory for them to see a different midwife, a different health professional all the time. They needed to see the same familiar face. And those were the concept of choice, continuity of control that came out of Changing Childbirth. Since then, we've had various other reports in the UK. We've had the National Service Framework for Women and Children in 2004, which talked about very much the same kinds of things. We had Maternity Matters, another document in 2007, which also talked about choice. There were choice guarantees in that report. Women should have the choice of where they gave birth, where they had their antenatal care, where they laboured. And those choices had to include obstetric unit, if that's what they so desired, freestanding birthing units, alongside birthing units, which were both examples of midwifery-led care, and home birth as well. So the choice guarantees came out of those documents. And then Birthplace in England, which you may have heard about, a very seminal, influential piece of work, was done and reported in 2011, and that looked at the outcomes of straightforward, normal, low-risk women in the different localities in which they gave birth. And what that found was that it is as safe as that midwifery-led care was as safe as obstetric-led care for low-risk women and babies, particularly if women had had babies before. So the outcomes were really good. So there's no difference. There was no reason for women who were low risk and straightforward to always opt or only have the choice of obstetric-led care, which is actually, there were economic analyses attached to this piece of work, which was actually much more expensive than a low-risk birth professionally led by midwives. And that was Birthplace. That was the Birthplace in England study, and that influenced the most recent review of maternity services, which we call Better Births. And in that review, the guarantees for that are that women should have personalised care, irrespective of their risk status. It should be individually tailored to meet their needs in places that they can access, but most significantly that there should be continuity. So that continuity comes with, if it's a midwifery-led care, with women having a team of midwives, a small team, looking after them throughout the whole pregnancy continuum, so that they know the midwives who are going to look after them antenatally. They will know the midwives who give birth, who attend them when they give birth, when they labour and give birth. And that's because that model of care has been found to have really good outcomes. So midwifery-led care in other studies have been found to have really good outcomes in all sorts of different characteristics and different ways. So knowing this, looking at this before I started my research, led me to ask the question, what defines midwifery-led care? What is it about it? What are the strategies and tactics that midwives use in intrapartum care in particular, when they are in intrapartum settings, that make it different? Remember, the Birthplace in England study only looked at low-risk women and found the outcomes to be different if those women gave birth in obstetric units. So if we just look at midwifery-led units which have the best outcomes for low-risk women, what is happening? That's what I wanted to know, and that was what the question. And so the evidence suggests, and literature suggests, that a really good way of starting when you're asking these kinds of questions is to do a concept analysis. And with a concept analysis, what you end up with are the things, the defining attributes which are going to be present whenever you have a particular concept. So I wanted to find out what are the defining attributes of midwifery-led care. What I found was that if you have midwifery-led care, you have belief that childbirth is a normal life event. If you have midwifery-led care, you have the idea that women are the final decision makers. If you have midwifery-led care, you find that what is foregrounded is supportive, trusting relationships. And finally, midwifery-led care is associated with midwives being autonomous lead professionals. So this concept analysis led directly to my research question: how are the defining attributes of midwifery-led care enacted in midwifery-led intrapartum settings? And what that means is, how do midwives do it in those settings? What do they do? What are their strategies? What are their tactics? What are their thinking? What do they feel that they need to do in order to deliver this midwifery-led care? How is it enacted? How is it operationalised when you have settings that are run by midwives? So I want to now take you through the steps of my research. I'll start off by saying that it was a qualitative multiple case study. Qualitative because I'm not looking for numbers. I'm not looking for how many midwives did this. I'm looking for an in-depth analysis, a drilling down of what the defining attributes are and how they are actually operationalised in practice. So I want to know the depth of what midwives feel, and I want to know the depth of their understanding of what their practice means. And that necessitates a qualitative approach. I wanted to do a multiple case study. Methodologically, it's more sound for case studies to have more than one site or more than one object of analysis. So my multiple case study consisted of looking at what midwives did in a freestanding midwifery unit, which is a midwifery unit which is geographically separate from an obstetric unit, and also looking at what midwives did in an alongside unit. I wasn't so much trying to look for the differences with those, but what I wanted was more data that would give a more complete picture. I wanted to be able to use as my data collection methods observation. It was very important for me to be able to actually observe labour. I wanted to see what those tactics and strategies that midwives did were. I wanted then to be able to interview midwives and get their perspective. So qualitative research really is about getting the perspective of the participant. I wanted to know what they felt about their craft, about their skill. I wanted also, as well as observing care, as well as interviewing, to know what the influences of their care were. So I wanted to look at documents. I did document analysis. Documents is a broad term. I looked at guidelines. I looked at memos in team meetings. I looked at some of the information that was put out to the women using this service. So I looked at those and I applied the same codes and themes that I derived from analysing the data on observation and interviews. So my method of analysis was called framework analysis. And the advantage of framework analysis, which at the end of the day is another type of qualitative analysis, the advantage is that you end up with a matrix of direct quotes taken from the raw data, which then can be traced directly back to the themes and the codes that you've found out from analysing your data. So I'll give you an example. If one of the themes I got from analysing the data was that, let's say the women are the decision makers in care. What I want to be able to do is to find out where that came from, the raw data. And this matrix allowed me to do that. Okay. One of the first steps of framework analysis is really embedding yourself in the data that you have. And that's called familiarization. So that's reading and rereading the transcripts. I took the decision to transcribe all of my data, all of my observations and all of my interviews. I did that myself, but what the advantage of that was that I got to know it really, really well. I lived this data. I started in my interpretation of this data right from the beginning. As a researcher, it's very important to recognise the fact that you bring to the data, you bring to your analysis something of yourself. And this is embodied in a concept called reflexivity. So reflexivity is about acknowledging the part that you play in shaping the interpretation of the data, shaping the interpretation and the analysis. So I'm coming to this research as a midwife, as somebody who is involved in midwifery-led intrapartum care, as someone who really upholds the principles of midwifery care. So those things can't be separated from the interpretation and the analysis. And those things are very much recognised in qualitative data analysis. So my framework came up with this matrix where anyone looking at my data can see how I derived my themes and my codes. The raw data is there, it's available for anyone to see, to use, and I got the permission from all the participants so that another researcher can come and look at the raw data, and they may come up with entirely different interpretations. But that's fine, because what I have done is shown quite clearly how my interpretations have led to the themes and codes that I have. And that is really the advantage of that framework analysis. It gives you that audit trail. So what about the findings? I managed to have 16 interviews of midwives across my two sites, my alongside midwifery unit and my freestanding midwifery unit. And I was privileged enough to observe 3 births. And so with that amount of data, I was able to come up with how these defining attributes were enacted in midwifery-led intrapartum settings. And I was able also to add the added data collection method of the documents, because I really wanted to know, it's fine for me seeing all of this, but I want to know what also overrides midwifery-led care, so it's important to know what their influences are. So let me just take you now through what I find for each of those 4 defining attributes. So the first attribute was about supportive and trusting relationships. And what did I find? I found that midwives did that through transactional and reciprocal relationships. What does that mean? It means that there was an exchange between midwives and the women. It wasn't coming from one party. It meant that there was reciprocity. I found reciprocity fascinating. I found reciprocity in the way that if a woman was standing at the counter and she was swaying through the rhythm of the labour, the midwife would be standing alongside her, swaying with the rhythm of the labour. I found reciprocity really fascinating because the midwives almost took on the persona of the woman. They were replicating what the women were doing. There was that reciprocity. And that was an instinctive thing, and those midwives would not have known that they were doing that. That might be something that comes when you have trust in a relationship. I found they enacted this through having an idea that the relationship was more than about having safe, respectful care. Safe and respectful care is an absolute fundamental, but the midwives wanted more than that. There was more than that in this exchange. They needed to have a level of closeness with the women. So they needed really to be able to relate to these women on a human level. So it was actually important what the midwives felt, what their emotional investment was also important, and they needed to get that reflected from the women. They enacted these supportive and trusting relationships by being trusted by women. They really felt it important for women to trust them. There are lots of advantages of being trusted by the women. It meant that the women might listen to them, say if an emergency arose, quickly. They might listen to them and move quickly to what they are suggesting. So there were advantages in that, but also they really believed that women had the ability to give birth in a straightforward physiological way. And they really believed that. So imagine how important that is for a woman going through this journey. She's chosen this particular thing, to have a midwife having a matter-of-fact belief that they're going to do it. Also, there was a development of a rapport. So it was very, as I said, it's beneficial if you've got that rapport, if there are interventions needed. How did they get that rapport? Because remember, these were not continuity models. These midwives did not know these women before. The women did not know the midwives before. What did they do then? Because the research shows that continuity has really good outcomes. But these midwives knew that there was something that they could do to circumvent the lack of knowing these women. And what did they do? They knew the importance of developing a rapport quickly. So they used all kinds of tactics to do that. Really important was the investment they had in treating women like family and accommodating whatever birth partners the women desired. They didn't count how many birth partners that were there. If a woman wanted to have the mother, the sister, the partner there, they would accommodate it. It was not a problem for them to have that. And that was their investment and their acknowledgement of the importance that childbirth is a social phenomenon, and that because it's a social phenomenon, you naturally want to have those people you trust around you. There was also an idea that midwives were professional servants. So it was more actually that they were servants, but they were professional servants because they were professionals. But this idea that they were almost like ladies in waiting, which is how it was described by one particular midwife. You are their lady. You are there to do what they need. I've got some quotes for you from the raw data. And I'll do those now. Obviously, it's much easier to make those kinds of midwife decisions because you've got that kind of relationship with the lady. And hopefully you've already got an idea of the response, a kind of prediction of where that's going to go. Another quote, on the whole, women using the birth centre are mostly women I haven't met before. So you've got to get in there. I do that by use of comedy as well, but when it's appropriate. I try to make people laugh, as laughter can help move things along and quickly make them trust and like you. And finally, it's almost like in old school Downton Abbey or something, you're her lady. So Downton Abbey is a British period drama that shows the lives of upper middle class people in their big houses and all the servants and people that are used to serve them. So this midwife is saying, you're her lady in waiting. You are there to serve her. The next defining attribute is belief in childbirth as a normal life event. How was that enacted? Another really important attribute. So midwife-led unit midwives embodied belief in normality. Everything they did made it really clear that they immediately believed that the women who were going to come in were going to give birth in a normal physiological way. That was their standing point. they used multiple sources of knowledge to guide their practice and understand what was and was not normal. So they used their intuition, they used their experiential knowledge, because one of the other defining attributes that I'll come to made it clear that they really acknowledged the importance of midwives who worked on their having experience. So that's intuition, experiential knowledge. They used evidence from guidelines, so scientific evidence, and they used their understanding of physiology. So it wasn't just any one type of knowledge. They had a whole package of influences on what they were doing. Another way they enacted the belief in childbirth as a normal life event was that midwives were creative in seeking solutions and moving seamlessly between these different forms of knowledge. So I said intuition, I said scientific knowledge. Those two don't marry automatically, but they were able to use all of these and move seamlessly with them. They balanced action and no action. Judicious and careful decisions were made about intervention. So sometimes they knew that they didn't have to act. They could be there as the guardians of physiology. Sometimes they realised, whether it was from their experience, from intuition, from knowing about guidelines, from knowing about physiology, that they needed to act. So they balanced these two things. They balanced action and no action, but they were very judicious in how they used interventions. It was not that they didn't want to use interventions, it was that they chose interventions very wisely and very discriminately. And they also had an organisational culture that was supportive. It was really important for them to have in their organisations, mostly in their immediate vicinities of the birth centre, to know that their culture was supportive of all of these things. It was important for them to have that. So some of the quotes that came from that, and remember these are direct quotes from the midwife participants. Well, usually I make a proposal and, for example, if everything's normal, if everything's going well, I'm not really asking for her to move or become active. I don't give any indication. I leave the woman actually follow what they feel to. And I'm just looking and I'm listening. I am in this way passive, no? Another quote. Another feature of midwifery-led care is the level of responsibility midwives have when they are the lead professionals. They need to have the knowledge to recognise when a situation goes away from normality. In labour, there's a process of continuous assessment, and any minute it can go off, and midwives need to be able to recognise deviation. And finally, obviously you have to work within the set of guidelines, but if there is a little bit of deviation and the woman wants to come in here, we cannot say she is not going to have her care here, because she has a choice as long as you have made her aware of the risk. The third of the defining attributes is women are the final decision makers. So how was that enacted? They did that, midwives did this defining attribute by negotiating with women's choices to bring about change. And what that means is that often we get this idea that women are the decision makers, and often that is one of the attributes of care that is put in documents, in vision, mission statements, etc. But what I found was that there's much more of a nuanced picture of decision making. So that one of the important things that came out of this, that midwives often negotiated with women for their decisions. So midwives were in a position of being these people who were educated and professional and knowledgeable about the process of birth. And though women were the experts in their own birth, they didn't have that overall picture. So how do you marry those two? And what I found was a constant unfolding of negotiation between what the women wanted and what the midwives would have advised. in those particular situations. So it was negotiation. I found that decision making was a group effort. Even if you were that midwife charged with attending that woman's labour and birth, you were not on your own. There was an understanding that it was your colleagues behind you who were also invested in that care. So midwives would come out and they would come to the midwives' room and they would ask, they would say, this is happening, what do you think? That's happening, what do you think? The midwives who were in the office and who weren't looking after a woman at that time would always be thinking, what's going on in that room? How is that midwife working? How is that woman doing? So there was a group effort in terms of how they gave care and the decisions that were made around the care as well. The thing that I found also was that committing themselves to women being the final decision makers could be problematic for midwives and uncomfortable. Somebody needed to have the midwife's back if they were going to take that stance of supporting the woman with whatever decisions that she was going to take. So some of the quotes around that, some of the things that midwives said were as follows. And again, these were directly from the midwives. We need to move away as midwives from allowed or risk. What we need to do is say, okay, here are the chances of what may happen if you have this or that, or if this happens, or if that should happen, because this is your background, you are more inclined for this to happen or something. But if she turns around and says, I don't care, then we need to be all right. We need to be saying, all right, then fine, that's your decision. I've given you all that information, and if you want to do that, then you have our whole undivided support. And another quote. There's a lot of conversation you have with women. We've been going at this labour now for some hours and we've tried this. I think we should start talking about within the next hour what we're going to do. It's those conversations you have so that the woman is far more engaged with her care. And finally, another quote. Someone having your back is important. An example is a woman with borderline mental health problems who had a PPH and refused to be transferred to the hospital. There was a clear plan in place, the plan was followed, but the birth centre has to be safe for women and babies. It's not just about women's wishes, there are 3 parts to it. Women, baby and midwife all have to feel safe. And that quote is really important because that shows the problematic nature sometimes that midwives are faced with when they are being wholeheartedly supportive of women's choices. They need to feel that, yes, they are committed to honouring women's choices, but behind them, they need a support mechanism. So the final defining attribute, midwives as autonomous lead professionals. So what does that mean? How was that enacted in practice? Midwives were very happy to step up to their leadership and autonomous role. So they expected that. That was self-evident from all of their education that they were autonomous lead practitioners. Another thing that came from that in the way they enacted it was that advocating for women was part of their leadership role, but it was problematic if safety was compromised. And I think the quotes from the previous theme exemplify how that could be problematic. And another way of enacting this final attribute was that autonomy was less important with women. It was more important in their interfacing with professionals. And this is something that I found wasn't really clear in the literature. And when I go on to talk about what my study contributes to existing literature, I will be talking about this point. The point that it was less important for women, for midwives, to feel that they needed to show their autonomous stance when they were dealing with those midwives in their vicinity or with those women in that room. And some of the quotes that came from that. And again, these quotes are from the midwives. So for me, that means that the midwife is taking the lead in care, but only in the sense that they are the ones that would go in and kind of be with women, make the assessments and decide as and when maybe other people needed to come in for help and support, or if she needed kind of a change in the setting. And another quote, but also knowing when to say, actually, no, we have to support the woman in what she wants. Trying to make sure everyone in the room is supportive of the woman and that we're all on the same page. Can often be just reassuring both partners so that they're not scared anymore and that they can support that woman with her choices. And another quote, the woman can choose to birth where she wants to give birth, okay. So what needs to be in place is certain structures. So if that woman presents whilst you're on duty and you don't feel comfortable to give her labour care for whatever reason, then there's something in place for you. Now technically there's meant to be, but there isn't in reality, yeah? So that can then leave the midwives feeling really unnerved, yeah? Oh God, I hope she doesn't come in on my shift. And then finally, I'm quite realistic in that true autonomy will be that you're working with just you and that woman and whatever her wishes are. But when you're working within the NHS in a trust, you have got to be mindful of the fact that you are working under a contract to the trust. In a way, you can be more autonomous in an MLU, in a midwifery-led unit. So those were the enactment of those defining attributes. I've gone through what the defining attributes were. I've gone through how the steps of how they are enacted in practice and some of the direct quotes that come that support those findings. When I was doing my research, yes, I was looking at the defining attributes, but inevitably a whole set of other data revealed itself to me which I couldn't really take no notice of, and these were called the open coded findings, and I'm going to just go through some of those now. There were two themes in the open coded findings. One of those was preserving self and one of those was working together. So what came out with preserving self? Three things. The first was gatekeeping. That was really important. That was really interesting to see. And what gatekeeping meant was that those midwives were almost territorial. They were very careful about who they allowed to come into their vicinity to work as midwives. Now what needs to be borne in mind is that they didn't really have any say about who was employed in the midwifery-led units. But what they did, and these are one of these kind of cultural things that they did, was to be very clear about scrutinising midwives' practice so that it fell in line with their practice, because they knew that what they did worked. And if they had another midwife coming in, they wanted to be sure that they would practice along the same lines. And that was about gatekeeping. Another really interesting concept that came from this was collective consciousness. Now, collective consciousness is a sociological term, but what it really means is that everyone in that vicinity felt the same about things. They had almost one consciousness, and that ties in with their culture, with the organisational culture, but they felt the same about how they did their care, how they delivered their care. And that was shown really by when I, in the interviews, I gave them a vignette, I gave them a model case which is derived from a concept analysis, so a model case of midwifery-led care, and that involved a story of a woman coming into labour and what she would expect to find. And each midwife that I interviewed said things like, that is so birth centre, that is exactly what we do. And so if each of those midwives came to that conclusion about that vignette, that meant that they collectively had the same ideas about what was happening in their units. Another thing from this preserving self, which was preserving their identity, was about keeping it safe. They were really concerned with safety. And one of the reasons they were concerned with safety was that in their perception, they felt that other parts of the maternity service felt that they were not safe. And so what they had to do would be constantly be on their guard, constantly have their skills up to date, so that they were able to demonstrate that if deviations happened, that they were able to give safe care. That was really important to them. So that was the preserving self. The other thing was about working together. So this was the other part of the open coded themes. And what was that about? They felt that one of the things was being part of a whole. They felt that they were part of a movement of midwifery. And they felt that really keenly. They felt, for example, and the way that I interpreted this and analysed this was the idea of childbirth being almost like an ecosystem, existing with all the other ecosystems, and how important that was for midwives to preserve that and to work towards advocating for that. So that was looking at childbirth from the human perspective and how important that is as a human race and being part of that whole. Another thing was an idea that two heads are better. The second midwife makes you strong. This was really strongly felt by the midwives. They felt like as long as they had a second midwife they could trust, that part of their culture, part of the whole, collective consciousness, all of those things, they felt confident about providing care. That other midwife was someone to pass the baton to, that other midwife was someone to relieve them, that other midwife was a moderator for their care, that other midwife was a person to bat ideas with, back and forward with. They needed that second midwife. So, I've given you a picture of my research. I've given you a picture of the defining attributes and how they're enacted. I've given you a picture of the open codes, which I also found. And all of that encapsulated led me to develop a model for midwifery care. And so this model of midwifery care, it's a thematic model for the enactment of midwifery care. On the one hand, it has the defining attributes and how they are enacted from the findings. On the other hand, it has the open codes and what they mean. So part of this research was to develop this theoretical model, and I hope that you get the opportunity to actually see that model. What the study adds to existing knowledge is really key for a PhD, because at the end of this journey I am supposed to, or any PhD student is supposed to be able to say, I have added something, this is worthwhile, I have found something original. So even if they weren't original as such, my findings would have added increased knowledge to extant knowledge. So part of the discussion in my thesis would have been, how do these findings relate to what we know anyway? And is there anything new? And so what I've come up with is the following. So what has my research added to what's existing? One of the things is that distance from the host obstetric unit strengthens the midwifery-led unit midwives' opportunity to act autonomously and preserve the collective ethos that normal physiological birth is possible. It introduces the idea of greater discretion in carrying out care. Another thing that's come to the fore in my research is that midwifery-led unit midwives place a premium on expertise and experience in themselves and their colleagues, and how this serves their needs to demonstrate their safety and protect their territory. They need to have midwives in those vicinities who are going to be able to contribute to that overall understanding that they are safe places for women to labour and give birth. Thirdly, there is a negation of the need to express autonomy when immersed in the midwifery-led environments. And so what that means is that in that immediate relationship with the woman, the midwife as a professional is not so important. What is needed is the midwife as the supporter and the guardian of that birth. They do not need to assert their stance as an autonomous professional in that vicinity with the woman. That is something that they do outside of that room. That's something that they do in their interactions with other professionals. Fourthly, midwives worked through their desire to override women's choices in unsafe situations, and that highlights the need to be supported by senior leaders and the wider maternity team. So midwives felt nervous and uncomfortable about being in situations where women were making choices which they thought could be potentially unsafe. It wasn't that they didn't honour those choices, but they had to work through that in order to honour those choices. But what needed to be and what needs to be in place for them is another support mechanism, an external support mechanism coming from the senior midwifery leadership and the wider maternity team, so that they can confidently give women the care that they want. And then another one, midwifery-led units were committed to normal birth and were preoccupied with safety. So normal birth is a term that has received a lot of attention since about 2017. So there's been a lot of attention worldwide in the UK about even using the word normal birth. The midwives were very committed to that term because they knew what they meant by the term was an understanding and an appreciation and acknowledgement of the fact that these women were able to achieve physiological birth. Another one was that midwifery-led unit midwives are keen to demonstrate competence and safe practice to the wider team. So that was really about having this idea, this perception that they were not considered to be safe places, and them having a keenness to demonstrate that they were safe. That was really important in how they did their care. Penultimate one is that midwifery-led units had professional pride in the skills with dealing with high-risk situations as they arose, and were aware that such skills were needed and needed constant attention. So their expectations and their commitment and their acknowledgement that women could achieve normal physiological birth did not deter them from having an understanding that they needed to have the skills to intervene where necessary to keep everything safe. And finally, midwifery-led unit midwives believed intrapartum care with an unknown midwife model, so where women didn't know the midwives beforehand, can lead to successful relationships. Their data, their everyday working situations told them that they did not need to have known these women beforehand, although they appreciated the idea of a continuity of care model. Their empirical evidence told them that they were able to be successful without that. So I would love to take any questions that you have about my research. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you will be able to read in the future some of the publications that come out of the research. I couldn't have done it without the midwives and the women being really willing to give me the space and the opportunity to observe them. And obviously the research had to go through ethics approval, and so all the consent had to be done by the women and the midwives. So thank you for listening.